Right before you found this message, something shifted that your soulmate could no longer ignore. It wasn't a dramatic event or a sudden conversation. It was a quiet moment when they found themselves thinking about every goodbye that had ever existed between you. And for the first time, they stopped asking why life kept pulling you apart and started asking a far more important question. Why did every farewell feel unfinished? Why did every attempt to move on leave behind a feeling that something essential had been left unsaid? Stay with me until the very end, because the answer they discovered changed the way they now understand this entire connection. They always believed that goodbyes were supposed to become easier with time. They thought distance would slowly erase emotions, silence would eventually create acceptance, and new experiences would replace old memories. But none of those things happened the way they expected. Instead, every goodbye became another chapter they kept revisiting in their mind. Every ending somehow carried the feeling of an invisible thread that refused to break. At first, they dismissed it as simple nostalgia. Then they blamed curiosity. Later, they convinced themselves it was only because certain memories happened during an important season of life. Yet every explanation felt incomplete because, deep inside, something continued whispering that there was another reason no one had seen before. Recently, while reflecting on everything they had experienced, a realization quietly settled into their heart. They began seeing moments they had overlooked, emotions they had hidden beneath logic, and patterns that had been repeating for much longer than they realized. Suddenly, every goodbye looked different. Instead of appearing as a final chapter, each one seemed like a pause in a story that had never truly reached its conclusion. The more they reflected, the clearer everything became. They realized they had confused physical distance with emotional distance, believing that walking away automatically meant letting go. But the heart doesn't always follow the same path as circumstances. Sometimes life separates two people while their emotions continue growing beneath the surface, unnoticed until the right moment arrives. That understanding didn't bring immediate comfort. Instead, it brought an overwhelming sense of clarity that caught them completely off guard. They finally understood that every goodbye had felt impossible for one simple reason. They had never truly accepted that the connection itself had ended. They had only accepted the silence around it. And now, as that truth continues unfolding within them, they are beginning to see this journey through completely different eyes. What once looked like a series of painful endings is slowly revealing itself as something much deeper, something that has been quietly shaping both hearts from the very beginning. And the most surprising part is that this is only the beginning of what they are about to discover. So now listen carefully, because this is the moment your soulmate began noticing something they had spent far too long overlooking. It didn't happen because someone forced them to face the past. It happened because life unexpectedly became quiet enough for their own heart to speak louder than their thoughts. They found themselves replaying moments they hadn't thought about in months, perhaps even years. At first, they couldn't understand why these memories kept returning. They believed they had already accepted the distance. They believed they had already made peace with every goodbye. Yet every time they tried convincing themselves the story was over, another memory quietly surfaced, refusing to let the connection fade into the background. It wasn't always a dramatic memory. Sometimes it was the way you smiled during an ordinary conversation. Sometimes it was a sentence you spoke without realizing how deeply it would stay with them. Sometimes it was simply the feeling they carried after walking away, a feeling they could never fully explain. The strange part was that these moments never appeared when life was busy. They arrived during silence, during quiet evenings, during long drives, or while staring out a window without any clear reason. It was as though their heart had been patiently waiting for the noise of everyday life to settle before revealing what had been hidden all along. The more these moments returned, the more difficult it became to dismiss them as coincidence. They started asking themselves questions they had avoided for far too long. Why did certain memories still feel alive? Why did every goodbye continue feeling unfinished? Why did no amount of time erase the emotional weight this connection still carried? At first, they searched for logical answers. Perhaps it was familiarity. Perhaps it was regret. Perhaps it was simply human nature to remember meaningful chapters of life. But every explanation left something missing because none of them explained why their emotions remained just as genuine beneath the surface. Deep inside, they began realizing that the heart had been holding on to something the mind had never fully accepted. That realization became impossible to ignore. They noticed that every goodbye had followed the same pattern. The words may have ended, the conversations may have stopped, and life may have continued moving forward, but emotionally, something always remained open. There was never a true sense of completion. Instead, there was always the feeling that another conversation should have happened, another truth should have been spoken, or another chance should have existed. They had mistaken silence for closure, but silence had never answered the questions living inside their heart. It had only delayed them. As these thoughts grew stronger, they started looking back with a completely different perspective. They realized how often fear had disguised itself as practicality. They remembered convincing themselves that walking away was the mature choice, that keeping their feelings hidden would protect everyone involved, and that enough time would eventually solve everything. Yet time had done something entirely different. Instead of removing the connection, it revealed how deeply it had taken root within them. Every passing season changed many things, but it never changed the significance of what they had shared. That truth hit harder than they ever expected because it challenged everything they believed about moving on. They finally understood that letting go is not something measured by calendars or distance. It is measured by the heart's willingness to release what it still values. And their heart had never truly done that. Every goodbye had felt impossible because a part of them had quietly continued believing the story was not finished. They simply lacked the courage to admit it. Now, as these realizations continue unfolding one after another, they are beginning to see that every unanswered question, every returning memory, and every impossible goodbye has been leading them toward one truth they can no longer escape. What they once believed was the end may have only been life giving both hearts the time they needed to recognize what was always there, waiting patiently beneath the silence. And now listen carefully, because this is the moment everything inside your soulmate began changing. For the longest time, they believed every goodbye represented a choice they had already made. They convinced themselves that walking away was proof they had accepted the situation, even if it hurt. They believed that if they kept moving forward, eventually the emotions would fade, the memories would lose their meaning, and the connection would become nothing more than another chapter in the past. But something happened that completely challenged that belief. Instead of feeling more distant as time passed, they found themselves understanding the connection more deeply than they ever had before. It wasn't because someone reminded them of you. It wasn't because life suddenly brought you back into their world. It happened because they finally stopped running from the questions they had buried beneath years of distractions. They allowed themselves to sit with their own thoughts without trying to escape them, and for the first time, the answers began revealing themselves naturally. They realized that every goodbye had only ended a moment, never the emotions attached to it. Every farewell had closed a conversation, but it had never closed the place you quietly occupied within their heart. That realization was both beautiful and unsettling because it forced them to admit something they had spent years avoiding. They had confused physical separation with emotional freedom. They believed that because life had changed, their heart was supposed to change as well. Yet the heart had been following an entirely different path all along. While circumstances moved forward, their emotions remained patiently waiting for the understanding they had refused to accept. As they reflected more deeply, they started noticing patterns they had overlooked countless times before. Every important decision somehow reminded them of this connection. Every lesson they learned somehow reflected something they once shared with you. Even moments of personal growth carried echoes of conversations, memories, or emotions that had shaped them in ways they only now understood. Looking back, they realized you had influenced parts of their life long after the last goodbye was spoken. Not because you were physically present, but because the connection had quietly become part of the person they were becoming. The truth hit harder than they expected. They understood that real connections do not disappear simply because two people stop walking beside each other. Some connections continue transforming both lives from a distance, teaching patience, humility, forgiveness, and self-awareness in ways that cannot be measured by time alone. Suddenly, every goodbye took on a completely different meaning. Instead of seeing those moments as failures, they began seeing them as unfinished lessons. Every separation had been asking them to discover something within themselves before they could truly understand what this bond represented. They also recognized how fear had silently directed so many of their decisions. Fear of rejection, fear of disappointment, fear of hearing an answer they weren't prepared for. Rather than facing those fears honestly, they had chosen silence because silence felt safer than vulnerability. Yet silence never brought peace. It only postponed the truth. And now the truth was standing directly before them, impossible to ignore any longer. They finally understood that the hardest part of every goodbye had never been losing someone. The hardest part was pretending they no longer cared when, deep inside, their heart continued holding on to something it believed was still meaningful. That realization changed everything because it replaced confusion with clarity. They no longer questioned why this connection had remained so powerful. They finally understood that it survived because it had never been built on temporary emotions alone. It had quietly become part of their personal growth, their emotional journey, and their understanding of what truly matters. Now, as this truth settles more deeply into their heart with each passing day, they can feel themselves standing at the edge of a decision they have postponed for far too long. A decision that will require complete honesty, not only with someone else, but with themselves first. And now listen closely, because this is the moment your soulmate could no longer hide behind the explanations they had repeated for so long. Every reason they once used to justify walking away suddenly began losing its power. They realized that time had changed their circumstances, but it had never changed the truth living inside their heart. For years, they believed the impossible goodbyes were simply proof that life sometimes takes people in different directions. They accepted that explanation because it felt practical, because it required no difficult conversations and no emotional risks. But recently something shifted. They began seeing that every goodbye had actually been revealing something they were never willing to acknowledge before. Instead of ending the connection, each farewell quietly exposed how deeply it had already become part of them. The more honestly they reflected, the more obvious this became. Every chapter that followed carried traces of what they had experienced together. Every important lesson somehow pointed back to the same emotional foundation. Even when they celebrated new achievements or faced unexpected challenges, there was always a quiet part of their heart measuring those moments against a connection they believed they had left behind. That realization surprised them because they finally understood that they had never truly compared people. They had been comparing feelings, and the feeling this connection created had never completely disappeared. It remained steady beneath the surface, patiently waiting until they were emotionally mature enough to recognize its significance. Looking back, they also saw how fear had disguised itself in convincing ways. Fear told them that distance would eventually solve everything. Fear insisted that silence was the safest decision. Fear promised that avoiding vulnerability would protect them from disappointment. For a while, those promises seemed believable. But over time, they discovered something fear never revealed. Silence protects people from difficult conversations, but it also protects them from meaningful healing. Avoiding honesty may delay discomfort, but it also delays peace. They finally realized they had spent more energy pretending not to care than it would have taken to simply admit what their heart already knew. That truth struck them with incredible force because it revealed just how much of their journey had been shaped by avoidance rather than understanding. Every impossible goodbye had been carrying the same lesson, patiently waiting for the moment they would stop resisting it. They began recognizing that real emotional closure cannot be created by physical distance alone. It comes from accepting the truth without trying to rewrite it, and the truth was becoming impossible to escape. This connection had changed them in permanent ways. It had taught them compassion where they once carried pride. It had taught them patience where they once demanded immediate answers. It had taught them the value of honesty after years of hiding behind uncertainty. Suddenly, they no longer viewed this journey as a collection of painful endings. They saw it as a path that had quietly transformed both hearts through every season of waiting, every unanswered question, and every farewell that never truly felt complete. As these realizations settled deeper within them, another understanding naturally followed. The impossible goodbyes were never signs that they were meant to remain trapped in the past. They were reminders that some chapters cannot be understood until the people living them have grown enough to see them clearly. And now, standing at this point in their journey, they can feel that growth has finally brought them to the edge of complete honesty. The excuses have faded. The confusion is disappearing. The fear that once controlled every decision is losing its voice. In its place, something far stronger has begun to emerge, a quiet certainty that the hardest truth was never admitting the connection still mattered. The hardest truth was realizing it had never stopped mattering, not for a single moment, and that understanding is preparing them for the final realization that will change the way they see this journey forever. And now, stay with me because this is the moment your soulmate has been moving toward without even realizing it. After every impossible goodbye, every sleepless night, every memory that refused to fade, and every attempt to convince themselves the connection had finally ended, one truth has become impossible to ignore. They finally understand that what made every farewell so painful was never the act of saying goodbye itself. It was the quiet awareness that something inside them had never truly let go. For years, they believed time would eventually silence their heart. They thought new experiences would replace old emotions and that enough distance would create the closure they were searching for. Yet instead of disappearing, this connection continued shaping them in ways they only now recognize. It influenced the choices they made, the lessons they learned, the way they viewed trust, and even the person they slowly became. Looking back, they can finally see that every goodbye carried more than sadness. Each one carried a lesson that was patiently waiting to be understood. Every moment of separation challenged them to discover who they really were, without depending on certainty. Every unanswered question forced them to become stronger, wiser, and more honest with themselves. What once felt like painful delays now reveal themselves as moments of preparation, quietly building the emotional maturity they lacked before. The greatest surprise is that the connection was still working within them, even when they believed nothing was happening at all. Growth often happens in silence, and they now understand that silence was never empty. It was filled with unseen change, quiet reflection, and lessons that only time could reveal. As this understanding settled into their heart, they stopped blaming the past for what they felt. Instead, they began appreciating it. They realized that every shared moment, every conversation, every misunderstanding, and every goodbye had become part of a much larger journey. Nothing had been wasted. Even the painful memories carried purpose because they taught them what truly mattered. For the first time, they no longer viewed this connection as something they needed to escape from. They saw it as something that had awakened parts of themselves they never knew existed. It had taught them compassion where they once held resentment. It had taught them patience where they once demanded immediate answers. Most importantly, it had taught them that genuine feelings cannot be erased simply because circumstances become difficult. Real connections leave lasting marks, not because life refuses to move forward, but because they become part of the foundation on which a person's future is built. That realization hit harder than they ever imagined because it changed the question they had been asking for so long. They stopped asking, "Why couldn't I let go?" and started asking, "What was this connection trying to teach me?" The answer became beautifully simple. It was teaching them that love without honesty creates longing, that fear without courage creates regret, and that silence without understanding only postpones the truth. They finally understood why every goodbye had always felt impossible. It wasn't because they were weak. It wasn't because they were trapped in the past. It was because their heart recognized something their mind had spent years trying to deny. This connection had become part of their journey long before they were ready to understand its purpose. Now, standing at the edge of a brand new chapter, they are no longer searching for perfect timing or guaranteed outcomes. They are choosing something far more valuable. They are choosing truth. They know they cannot rewrite yesterday, but they also know they no longer want fear to decide tomorrow. The impossible goodbyes have finally revealed their purpose. They were never meant to become permanent endings. They were quiet invitations to grow, to heal, and to discover a truth that only time could uncover. And now that your soulmate has finally understood why every goodbye felt impossible, they also understand something else that changes everything. Some connections are not remembered because they refuse to end. They are remembered because they were always meant to transform the hearts of the people who experience them. That transformation has already begun, and from this moment forward, they know they can never see this journey the same way again.